Hello and welcome to Keep It Simple podcast. I'm Gavin Durson. Today I'm going to be doing another conversation. We've been calling this Simple Church Conversations. Pretty creative, I know. And today I'm going to be talking with a mentor of mine, really, David Toth. He's a guy that I'm so grateful for. When I started doing Simple Church 12 years ago, God plopped him down in my lap, and not literally, but he did bring him into my life, and it's been a huge blessing. Dave showed up. He'd been overseas after being a pastor in America for a while, came back, went overseas, came back, and let me know right off the bat. He said, "Hey, I'm really become convinced that house church is where my heart is, and what kind of ministry are you doing again?" And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And since that day, he's been somebody that I've really leaned on and sought out for guidance and wisdom. Really one of a handful of men in my life that over the course of my life, I would say that God has used to really be a major influence in my life. So Dave's a very special person to me, and I think he's been on the podcast before, but it's been a long time. So I thought I'd have him back on, and we would just have this conversation about discipleship and house church. And if you've listened to this podcast, I know we've talked about that some, but it's so important, and I think Dave has a lot to add to that conversation. And so we get into a little bit of house church and discipleship. How are those two kind of intertwined? And that's something that I think you're going to enjoy and hopefully get a lot out of. Before we get into that, just want to remind everybody that if you need anything, if we can help you in any way, I guess it's an unofficial sponsorship, simplechurchalliance.com. We put a lot of resources on there, and you can reach out to us through there as well. Simple Church Alliance is simply it's a relational network of people that are helping each other navigate life with Christ, a part of the church outside the traditional legacy church structures that many of us have grown up in. And we're not an anti-church, traditional church group, but we do feel that God is moving people outside of the traditional church to experience life with Him, and that it's not a bad thing. So some of you may come across this and think, well, I'm weird, or something's wrong with me, or I'm having these weird thoughts about maybe leaving a church or being a part of a church that's different. We hope that we can encourage you as you walk down that road, if that's something God's leading you to do. So feel free to reach out, and we'll set up a time to talk with you, come visit with you if need be. And if we can, we'll do whatever we can to help encourage you. That's what this is all about. So simplechurchalliance.com, check it out, and no strings attached. So without any further ado, let's get into my conversation with David Toth. All right, Dave. So we've known each other for a while, but I was thinking back, getting started here. Why don't you just give a little bit of your background, kind of your whole life story in about 60 seconds?
Oh man. Well, I've been in ministry for 40 some years, married for 52. Got saved when I was 25, and a number of different things took place. Was in the military and got out of the military, didn't know what to do with my life, and about that time came to Christ. And soon thereafter went to Bible college and seminary, and went in ministry. I was in pastoral ministry for a number of years. And then with the Christian Missionary Alliance, I was a church planning director for a region here in the States. Did that for a while, and then ended up as a missionary in Budapest. Lived in Budapest for 8 years, and then returned to the States, but continued to do the missionary work overseas. And so for the last 12 years, I've been making several trips a year, mainly to Eastern Europe and some to Central Asia. And my focus in the recent 10 to 12 years has shifted from teaching about church planting, which I still really love that ministry. But during this last 10 to 12 years, I have been focusing on discipleship. how to make leaders like Jesus made leaders, and how to make disciples like Jesus made disciples. So in a nutshell, I don't know if I made the 60 seconds, but that's about it.
That's pretty close. I guess we met when I was just getting started out doing Simple Church, and I was put in touch with you. And I remember you telling me, you said, "Well, Gavin, I don't know what kind of church planning you're involved in, but I want to let you know that over the last 10 or so years, I have grown to become a proponent of house church." And that was just like such an amazing thing to hear you say, because it was so encouraging to me that God had put you in my life. How did that happen for you? What happened there that helped you move from somebody who was pastoring traditional type churches for most of your life and being a part of those to someone who would say something like that, something crazy like that?
Yeah, well, there's not one short answer, probably two or three dynamics that were taking place simultaneously that led me to that final conclusion that house church is where I needed to be. And let me say right away, it's not, I'm not saying that everybody's got to end up in house church. I think some people do well in a traditional church, and some people do well in a house church. At any rate, I think the change took place while I was still living in Hungary and working as a missionary. And specifically, one component that moved me in the direction of house church was seeing how that a lot of difficulties in establishing a church were more organizational than they were doing spiritual ministry. It just seemed like working in post-Soviet Union area where there was a strong ambivalence to Christianity. If somebody wanted to plant a church in a traditional way, you had to have a place to do that. And in many cases, you had to have authorization from government, et cetera. And so there were a lot of hoops to go through. And I saw that taking a lot of time and energy. And so it just seemed like, wow, if you can, meet as a group in a house and do ministry in a house, that can be effective for, not having to worry about all of the governmental regulations and stipulations and difficulties. So that was one piece, not the only piece, but that was one piece. And then when we moved back to the States, I guess a couple of other pieces. One was really a financial piece. We moved back to the States, got involved in a traditional church again, and it was a good church, but we saw how much resource was being channeled into just keeping the existing organizational structures alive. And so that was a concern to me. And I think it was more of a concern because I was at that time just over 60. And, I was thinking about those days when I would get on Social Security or whatever, realizing that if I put a dollar bill in the offering plate, that somewhere upwards of 60 to 70%, maybe even 80% of that dollar would go just to keep copy machines running, fix the roof, take care of the parking lot, and all of that. It was just disappointing. It was disturbing to me. And so that was another piece of the dynamic that moved me towards house church. And then finally, the final one was very closely related, and that is the amount of time that was put into keeping programs and organizations running. And since I was focusing on discipleship, I just started playing around with numbers and talking to people and coming to the realization that a very large chunk of time was invested in keeping program and organizations running. and so little was even available to do discipleship ministry.
Mm.
If we're going to make disciples like Jesus made disciples, then discipleship ministry cannot take place during a 60 or a 90-minute window, for instance, on a Sunday or on any day for that matter. And yet so many people are on committees and involved in programs at the church as well as regular services. When I started asking them about the possibility of being involved in a discipleship relationship, and we talked about what that would take in terms of time investment, they many times they would respond and say, it sounds kind of interesting, but it's just not possible. By the time we do church on Sunday and we're involved in a couple of programs and the children are involved in a couple of programs, there just would be no time left for discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of the nail that sealed the coffin for me, because if we don't have the time to make disciples like Jesus made disciples, then for me, that was a serious issue. I thought, wow, that's just not going to work for me. And so rather than to complain about it or try to change the traditional program design church, I thought, man, I'm heading down this house church road.
Yeah.
And where we can, we can do house church with a smaller group of people, not be encumbered with a lot of entitlements that would draw our time and resources, and that would leave the door open to actually be involved in serious discipleship relationships with other people. So those are kind of the three dynamics that they created the perfect storm.
Yeah.
And for me, the wind blew me right into the house church.
I see. Yeah. Why do you think, and I don't want this to be, we can obviously take, critique, I guess, all day long. And that's not really, I know your heart or my heart, but what do you think happened? Where did something go wrong somewhere in the church that allowed things to get off track? Or is it just that maybe God is now the right time? Was that working well, and what God was doing for a long amount of time, and then we're a part of this movement of God opening other people's eyes to seeing some of these things? Or what are your thoughts about that? Like, what went wrong, or did it go wrong, or is it just now the time for change?
Well, I guess I don't know, two things come to mind. First of all, the really big issue is just our fallen nature. We're sinful. We're sinful people, redeemed by Christ, and so we're no longer slaves to sin. Yet we still have that lower nature, and part of that lower nature wants to do our thing. We want to have time for ourselves. We want to manage our responsibilities in time, and oftentimes in a selfish way. And so as we see over the course of human history, I think generally speaking, we are seeing issues get larger and worse instead of smaller and better. And so that's the big picture, put it in that frame. And then I think, secondly, if we look over the course of ministry history from the very first century, we see those periods of time where different movements realize a problem or realize that there's an issue that needs to be seriously addressed. It pops up. So therefore, for instance, we've seen prayer movements spring up over the courses of time that have really impacted different cultures and societies. And church planting movements have popped up. And even discipleship movements have popped up. And so when it comes to church, I think there's always been a house church somewhere. But more recently, I think we see that house church movement taking place. And they've there are people that just seem to be the right kind of people for house church. And of course, that begs another question: what is the right kind of person? I hesitate to be real hardcore about it, but generally, for those people that are self-starters, they have an intrinsic motivation to know more about what God wants to do in their life. They don't need somebody to lead them to the water, so to speak. I think those people do well in a house church. And now, combined, especially in our country, at least our culture with COVID, boy, that just really opened up the door, because in many cases, worship was not even possible in large gatherings. And so I think there were a number of people that perhaps had been considering something like house church, and now all of a sudden the door was wide open.
Yeah. 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 I think so. I think I would agree with all that. One of the things you have helped me to really think a lot about over the last, I don't know, has it been 12 years now, David? I don't know how long ago
Yeah,
it
I
was,
think
but
about 12. Yeah.
um, is just the idea of discipleship. And there's nothing magical about being a part of a house church that means that discipleship is going to happen. But you've brought up both of those things as being important to you. So how do you see discipleship and house church or simple church? How do you see those two linked? Or what might you say to someone who'd say, well, I am, I don't think you have to have both of those things. I just comments
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, I don't think you do have to have both those things. I think good discipleship can take place in a contemporary or traditional uh, program type church, as long as there is space for discipleship to take place. And specifically, what I mean in terms of space is time. Making disciples in a serious fashion, the way that Jesus did, is very time consuming. There's just no way to microwave, so to speak, microwave a person into maturity. It just doesn't happen. It takes time. It took Jesus almost, around approximately 2.5 years to get his guys up to speed. And so, it just takes a lot of time. And if you're in an organizational setting where that time is not available, or that time is dictated by different programs and activities, then it makes it more difficult. So, so I think that at least it doesn't have to, but a house church situation does open up opportunity for people to be involved in Christian activities that they feel are important. So, and I would hope that all Christians would say that discipleship is important. It's the one ministry that is commanded by Jesus. And it's interesting, he didn't say, go and worship. He didn't say, go and preach. He didn't say, go and teach. He said, go and make disciples. That's kind of interesting. He had the opportunity to command us to do whatever he wanted to, and he chose go make disciples. I don't think that was coincidental or by mistake. That was very intentional. And I think it's because discipleship is not one of the ministries to be put on the plate of opportunities, but it is the plate. There are many good ministries to be involved in. And I think being a good disciple and a good disciple maker helps people to be strong and good at whatever other ministry they might be involved in, whether it's worship, whether it's children's ministries, adult ministries. Having a good disciple in those ministries is certainly an advantage. It's positive.
So, what about specifically when we think about being in a house church? What are some ways you see maybe a house church environment being more conducive to discipleship? How does that,
Yeah.
like, what, how does that link work for you? Because it does, I mean, we've talked about this, but,
Hmm.
I think
Yeah.
one way of thinking about, for me, is that you could actually start with the question of, well, how would I make disciples like Jesus? And I think if that's where you start, I think something like Simple Church or House Church would
Hmm.
probably flow from that pursuit. Not a lot of people maybe get that, but what are your
Yeah.
thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. One, it allows people who are involved in house church to begin making disciples right in their own home. It's a good place to start.
Yeah.
uh, for guys to be discipling their wives and children, for moms to be discipling their husbands and children, that kind of peer-to-peer discipleship relationship that can take place in the context of a marriage, and then parents discipling their children. There's just no better place to start than right there. And it is very helpful and supportive when you have a small group of people, whether it's three or four families, and they're encouraging one another in those discipleship ministries, and then also hopefully reaching out and discipling a couple people outside of those circles. There you have the Great Commission in full spectrum. Right there in the house church taking place. So, and you don't have competing activities for time, where the house church can be really focused on discipleship, where it is the primary reason people get together to encourage one another in the process of discipleship, and learn more from each other, studying the word and allowing God to show us how to improve our discipleship ministries, and not having to worry about, well, we need to have a team get together this coming Saturday because we've got some roof repair, or we've got to strip the floors, and we're going to have people come in, strip the wax, and we don't have to do any of that. Our time is fully available for uh, getting together and doing discipleship with each other and also others. So it
So
fits. It's just
yeah.
opens up the door.
So look, for someone who, someone who's listened to this and maybe just stumbled upon this podcast and they're thinking, yeah, I think discipleship's important, but I don't really know. What are you even talking about? They may be thinking, get together and do discipleship. What is that? What does that even mean?
Yeah. Well, for me, there are many different definitions, and probably a lot of good ones. But the one that I use that really helps me to see discipleship in a short, abbreviated phrase, it's joining somebody else's life journey and being an instrument that God would use to help those people to be all that God wants them to be and do all that God wants them to do.
That's good. Yeah, I think one of the things that you and I've talked about, and that definition kind of hits on this a little bit. I think we've seen discipleship, or at least I have. I think I shared this with you, where it's almost we become it becomes another program. It's a discipleship program that we do with someone, or I've seen it to where discipleship is me, for example, would be me helping someone in, and maybe not intentionally, but I'm making them into my disciple rather than a disciple of Jesus. Talk a little bit about your thoughts on that. How do we help people really connect with Jesus and learn to follow him and not get ourselves in the middle of that? And how do we avoid making it something that's just another program that we're now calling discipleship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I hope that I'll be able to communicate something meaningful to answer it. I would put it this way: discipleship, like Jesus made disciples, is a lifestyle experience. It is not event oriented. In other words, it does not only take place during a 60 or a 90-minute meeting once or twice a week. And it is not informationally based. In other words, Jesus did not have a manual, and we don't have to have a manual either to follow. So it becomes spontaneous, not regimented. When I get together with my disciples, I never say something like, take your manual, because we don't use one. And if we did have one, I might say, well, open it up to chapter 12, and that's what we're going to be doing this week. That just is not a part of Jesus style discipleship. Instead, you're focusing on the disciple, investing as much time as possible into that person's life. That means, in the simplest of language, getting together with your disciples as often as possible. And in the course of those meetings, discussing how Jesus is working in your life, how he's working in their life. They see how you deal with crisis, how you deal with sin, how you trust, how you depend in faith upon the Father, how you listen to God. And so you're just talking constantly and modeling how that works in your life. And you're allowing other people to come into your more intimate circle. You're not in a classroom. You're in your living room, you're in their living room, you're at the restaurant drinking coffee together, you're at a football game having fun together. They see how you handle it when you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off. How do you respond to that crazy driver? So it's allowing people into your life and helping them to understand that Christianity is not a solo sport. It's more of a team thing. And it's very relational. It's organic. It's not academic. It's not, some kind of professional type of relationship. It's just living life in close proximity to a handful of other people and learning from each other how to deal with life experiences and how to trust God to get through them all.
Something that you have taught me over the years, and maybe you could comment a little bit about this, is that how really discipleship, it's all the things you said, relational, it's a relationship primarily, but I think a lot of people, when they think of, how, if God were to use me to disciple someone, that would sort of look like me trying to take charge of their Christian life and get them to do stuff and sort of mold them into my image of what I think they should look like. And
right.
I know a lot of people, I have never felt good when I feel like someone is wanting they've got an agenda for my life, for me, that may or may not be God's, or, there's a yucky feeling about that. And I think what you've taught me, that a lot of what discipleship is, it's really friendship, where your job really is you're asking people questions to help them focus on God, to drive them to the cross, to drive them to Jesus for answers, rather than maybe comment a little bit about the role of questions and discipleship.
Questions are so important. And actually, we see the master disciple maker, who is Jesus, doing exactly that. He asks a lot of questions, and insightful questions that really fit the moment, offer an opportunity to the person we're talking to really think carefully, to really think personally. And it causes them not just to give some kind of staid response, but it makes them think, wow, how does that affect me, and what would be the right thing for me to do, and how would Jesus do this or do that? And
Mm-hmm.
so asking questions is incredibly important. And again, we get that idea from Jesus himself, who did just that. In answering the first part of the question that how do we avoid just telling people what to do or instructing them? I like the phrase making disciples like Jesus made disciples. If we look at Jesus in the four Gospels, when he was involved in making disciples, of course, it was Jesus himself expressing his thoughts and ideas and doing things in relationship to his disciples. So, how do we do that? Well, we do that by taking the Gospels into our disciple making environment and still allowing Jesus to be the main speaker. And so when I get together with my disciples and we're talking about some different issues, one of the more common questions that I will ask is say, well, look what Jesus did with his disciples in a similar situation, and look what he said. How does that impact your situation? How would we respond to what Jesus is saying to us right now at this moment? And so Jesus is still, he is the instructor in a discipleship relationship today. His comments, his words, his teaching, his wisdom is still front and center. So I'm not the disciple maker in the sense that I'm the one calling the shots. I allow the Word of God, especially the narratives from Jesus in the Gospels, to be the primary instruction, and I just am with my disciples in discussion, talking about, look at what he said. What do you think that means? And how would that apply to your life going through the situation that you just talked about? So I like to see Jesus continue to make disciples.
Yeah. I will say that you have really modeled that well to me, and I'm great. I'm really grateful for that because that's been a huge difference in my life. So thank you. I would wonder, I know our time is running short, but if there was someone they would say, golly, I've never really I wouldn't know that I've been a part of discipleship with someone either that knows more than me or someone that I could influence. Like, what would be your advice to someone who may be listening to this saying, like, I think I need to be a part of a disciple making friendship like this? What advice would you give them?
Yeah. 2 words: start now. And of course, obviously that, begs the question, okay, what comes first and what do I do? Well, I would say the first thing is just to pray and say, God, I'm really interested in taking this whole discipleship thing seriously, and I'm not really sure how to start, but I'm willing to start if you're willing to be with me. And the neat thing about it is, if you look at the Great Commission where Jesus said, go make disciples, at the end of that command, he says, I'll be with you until the end of the age. So if you're willing to give it a shot, Jesus makes a promise, and he says, you will not be alone. I will be with you. So that's comforting and encouraging. And the thing to do is get together with 1 or 2 other people and say, hey, let's spend some time together a couple of times a week, one primary time perhaps, where it's more of a quote unquote formal time where you're going to get together and open up the scriptures and look at the scripture, especially the Gospels, and read a passage during the week and come together at that time and say, what is God saying? Does it mean anything to you? What do you think God wants you to do concerning an issue that you might be struggling with? Have you read something this week that really helped you to see God's wisdom and how you might take the next steps? and just get together. We can encourage one another. We can pray for one another and see what happens.
Mm. I love that, because I think so much of what, and you've shown this to me and encouraged me with this, is that so many times, like, I think we think to start making disciples or be a part of that process, that we've got to have it all figured out, and we've got to know that, oh, well, I know exactly how to do this. And it really is an exercise of faith on not only someone you might meet with, but on you to initiate a friendship that's centered around Christ with someone, and to be intentional about looking at the scriptures together with someone and asking, pointed questions. It really is a step of faith that you can test God with, in a sense that he promises he'll be with you, and
Yep.
you can kind of put yourself out there and watch him show up, and it doesn't always happen in every meeting or every time, but over the course of years, maybe probably some for you and some of me, it's probably, hopefully over the course of 12 years you might be able to see a little bit of progress, but it might just take some time. But you just walk together, and they end up influencing you, and you end up influencing them, and it really can be that simple. But it is sometimes hard to find people and to know how to make that question, to ask that, make that invitation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for folks it can be really hard. And I think what you said, praying and just being willing. You might get rejected several times before you ask, and just say, hey,
Yeah.
I'm looking for someone that might want to walk with Jesus with me, and would you be interested? Here's what I'm thinking it could look like initially. And we don't have to be legalistic about it, but maybe we could try to get together every week and read together. And if you ask 100 people, you might get one. But it does just take putting yourself out there a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I think it does. Not a lot of people may want to do it, but that's okay, because Jesus had a big idea when he came. He wanted to, he came to seek and to save. Luke 19 says he came to seek and to save all that was lost. So he had a big idea, but he started small. He chose a small group of people, main number, approximately 12 guys that he gave a whole lot of time to. And even beyond that, he went deep with just a handful, 3 guys. Peter, James, and John became part of that inner circle where Jesus lived and breathed. Man, they ate together. They walked down different villages together. They were with Jesus when he was healing people, when he was interacting with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They saw how he handled stress and pain. And, he just invested time in them, invited them to come. He said, hey, he says, I'll make you fishers of men. So, yeah, you just you only have to find 1 or 2. Don't get big numbers in your head, and let God take the lead.
And I think that, to me, the simple church piece of that is that, I don't, discipleship is individual, in my opinion. As you pointed out with Jesus, there was a few, and then there was this group of 12, and maybe there was more, when you count the women there, that seemed that, it seemed to be important there. It wasn't just a one-on-one endeavor. And so to me, I think in some ways, simple church is sort of like the same thing you do when you get together with 1 or 2, except you're doing it with a few more people. And sometimes I think it actually makes sense that to start a house church, you first would maybe learn to have that kind of relationship with one other person, and trust God from there, and learn how to walk with someone where you're not just telling them what to do, but you're both looking to Jesus together for wisdom. And then from there, as you learn how to have one friend like that, the Lord probably would entrust you with more, whether it's maybe that person's family or a neighbor of theirs or a neighbor of yours. You can really trust the Lord. It's not always linear like that, but I have seen it be linear like that.
Yeah.
To where it starts with one-on-one, and then it can grow. It grows from there into something that looks like a house church, a new local church family.
Yeah. I think one thing about house church that has really caught my attention, and I believe provides the perfect, maybe not the perfect, but a really good environment for Christian growth, is the whole idea that Jesus never meant his word to be the subject of an academic approach. And he never used the Bible as it existed in his day, of course, just in pieces, different Old Testament books. It was never used to enhance someone's intellectual knowledge of Christianity. He never did that. His focus on the word, or his Father's word, was obedience. How can we walk with the Father in obedience? How can we be in harmony with the Father? And the house church, I think, environment allows that to happen. We don't get together in a classroom type environment. There's nobody standing up, and we all sit in rows and listen to what that person says, so that we can gain a better intellectual understanding of Christianity. Instead, we get together and we share what God is doing in our lives, and we look at the Word, all for the purpose of how can we be more in harmony with God, more obedient to His Word and obedient to His will. And so house church really makes that possible.
Well, I really appreciate you taking time, Dave, to talk about all these things. We've talked about this, I know, a lot over the years. It's been super helpful to me. I know you put together a resource recently with MentorLink that I could probably make available on the website where we share this podcast, or even in the description. We'll put that in the description. But it was a tool that might be helpful to folks as they engage someone. Maybe you could just conclude by giving us a brief summary of that.
Yeah, it has not been posted on the MentorLink website yet. They're still going through the approval stage, but the final draft has been written. It's called True Disciples. And just really brief, the idea behind it. So many times I would be teaching about discipleship, and somebody would say, well, that sounds good, but I read something else that somebody else said about discipleship, and they have a different idea, and somebody else has a different idea. And I got to thinking, that's really true. Why should people listen to what I have to say? It's just my opinion and my experience of reading the Word. And so what do I do? How do I answer that person? And the idea came so clear one day, and that is to put together a tool that basically harvested exactly what Jesus said about being His true disciples. There are 6 statements in the New Testament where Jesus specifically concrete says, if you such and such, such and such, then you are my true disciple, or you are my disciples. And uses those words, my disciples, 6 times. And so I put together this short document that can be used to help people to see, all right, according to Jesus, not according to this guy or that guy, but according to Jesus, here's exactly what He said in these verses. And then I put some questions under each one that cause us to ask ourselves, what does that look like in our life? How am I doing? Where do I need some help, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, we'll see if we can link that up here. If it's not out officially yet, maybe we'll do an unofficial link.
I'll let you know as soon as it gets active on the link and gets posted.
If someone wanted to get a hold of you, Dave, how would you recommend them doing that?
Yeah, you can, get a hold of my email address. It's davidatoth@me.com. So that's David, A-T-O-T-H, @me.com.
Well, Dave, I appreciate you taking time. I know our time's out, but I really appreciate you being on here, and I'll look forward to seeing you in person here soon, hopefully.
Sounds good, Gavin. Always good to talk with you.
All right. We'll see you, David.
Take care, man.
All right.